Well, we're going on to lesson 55, and lesson 55 is on Aksum. So, do you know where Aksum is? Would you like to guess? Well, maybe I'll give you some clues here. How about this clue? An elephant! Yeah, they rode elephants there, and especially this part, because this part of the elephant became very, very wanted or precious. It's almost like a precious jewel. This part of the elephant, the tusk, was called ivory. And back in those days, the people of Rome and all over the world, they wanted to take that ivory and make things out of it because it seemed like it was very beautiful. Probably was, and pretty rare considering it comes from a whole elephant. And then, of course, we have these unusual creatures. Don't you love them? You know, I met some of them when I was in Africa. Oh, I gave you a clue. It was Africa. You know, giraffes, they're indigenous to Africa. So let's look where we are in Africa when we talk about Aksum, because this is a huge continent, a whole nother continent, and a whole nother empire. So let's look here. We have Ethiopia. So this is kind of the area that we're going to be talking about, but also it grew to a much bigger area, probably covering not only Ethiopia, but Sudan, and probably on into Kenya maybe. You know, that whole area was considered Aksum. It was also considered in the Bible under the name Cush. The ancient name for Aksum would have been Cush. So remember, Cush, Aksum, and Ethiopia. Those are common names that we're going to be talking about. Well, I love going to Africa, and I've been in this area a few years ago. We went there, and it was so amazing because we had to go out in the Serengeti, and we got to see ride jeeps and see all these animals that came up, and elephants and even lions and the wildebeest, and we got to see giraffes. In fact, we went to a place where the giraffes would come right up, and you could feed them there in the Serengeti. How spectacular is that? And we stayed there. But the most spectacular part, or the most memorable thing about being there for me, was that I got to have a Bible study with the women in the villages, in the remote villages. We were out there clear in this remote village. How exciting to sit there. And they said, they brought their Bibles. We want to know how to study the Bible. So I got to share how to study the Bible with them. And I also got to pray with them because a lot of them were sick with diseases, and a lot of them had lost their husbands to illness, and the children too were sick. So it was like as a nurse going there and helping them, but also to be able to give them Jesus. It was such an amazing time in Africa. And so my heart is from Africa. We went to the orphanages, and I went out into, not only the orphanages, we went out into the slums, and I got to do a VBS in the slums, Vacation Bible School in the slums, with thousands of kids. And I got to share the gospel in the slums. In the midst, there was a concert, and they said, Marianne, would you like to share the gospel? I got up on this little stage, and there was thousands of people, and I got to give them the gospel, and they all were raising their hand to accept the Lord. So I have a heart towards Africa. Yes, I love Africa. But let's talk about this Aksum, because this was a different part, they became very wealthy in this part of Africa. So in your book it says it was a market for all of ivory. In fact, they advertised the ivory, which I told before was from the elephant, and many people came from Rome and Italy and all the areas, even the Middle East. When we go Syria and Jerusalem, they're all coming to get the ivory. But not only that, there were other resources too. So we're going to be talking about Aksum in the year around 300 AD. Now, Aksum became this great important empire that's now Ethiopia. And it was in the years between like 200 years before Christ and about 200 or 300 years after Christ. It was a huge marketplace. most of that whole area was filled with people coming to get all of these things exported, like ivory, tortoise shells, rhino horns, gold, frankincense, even there, myrrh, silver. But do you know what the greatest export was? You want to guess? Slaves. Yes, slavery started a long time, even before Christ. They came and they sold slaves. You know, they exchanged, these merchants that exchanged their slaves and everything for all kinds of products that they would bring in too. You know, so they would give them slaves for like glassware, tools, jewelry, copper, iron, steel, textiles, whatever they could get. So it became kind of a lucrative marketplace, I'd say, especially if they were selling people. How terrible is that? Well, let's go into the Bible first, because do you know that Cush was in the Bible multiple times? This whole area talks about Cush, you know, and Cush being Aksum, okay? Moses married a Cushite woman. Didn't know that one. In Isaiah, he talks about beyond the rivers of Cush. He points there as to being far away. In Job, it talks about the topaz of Cush. In 2 Chronicles 14, it talks about King Asa of Judah was helped by God to fight Zerah, and Zerah was an Ethiopian that had 1 million men and chariots too. How big an army. It wasn't just a little African village then. Ebed-Melech was an Ethiopian that pulled Jeremiah out of the pit that he was in and saved him. So he was a good Ethiopian. And then we have also mentioned about Ethiopia in the book of Daniel, Amos, Nehemiah, Zephaniah, lots of different prophecies. So we find that the Aksum and the Cushites had been around a long time, huh? Plus, when we think of Aksum, we think of Arabians, because the Arabians came and crossed the Red Sea at some time, and they were called Sabians. And these Sabians, kind of reminds me with Arabians, you know, the Sabians came from Sheba, which we think Sheba of Dida, all that is over there by Saudi Arabia. The Queen of Sheba probably came from Africa, because as for the Sabians, they were there with the Africans. So that's where they think she probably came, when she came to see Solomon in the Bible. The Sabians immigrated to Aksum, and the Sabians are mentioned in the Bible. We see them in the book of Isaiah, that Isaiah talks about them being of good stature, means that they were strong. And then in Joel warns being sold to the Sabians. So we know it's mentioned, Sabians are mentioned in the Bible too. So when you think of Aksum and Sabians, you think they're a mixture of cultures. So their religion was a mixture of religions, because the Arabians worshiped their own gods and the Africans worshiped their own gods. And they had multiple little g idol gods, and they mixed them all up. In fact, sometimes that you'd see in the markets, you would see one that was possibly looking like he's a African Arabian god. That's Yeehaw they put in there, and you could tell that it was Arabian because the stones were put together without mortar. So you know that's how they knew it was Arabian. So the trading, we're going to 300 A.D., and the trading became the greatest market of Northeast Africa. And like I said, all those things they traded. The trading post, people came, like I said, from Greece, from Egypt, from Rome, from Ceylon. 3,000 miles they would come there to trade goods with them. And in Aksum, the people worked not only as merchants, but they also worked as on the sea, because it was on the sea as seamen and dock workers and messengers. And they actually used their money. They developed a type of money made out of salt and iron. And so they'd barter with these bars of salt and iron instead of money. And then later on in 200 AD, they minted their own coins. they were just like expert barterers. Do you know what a barterer is? It's someone that's trying to buy something from you and kind of barter with you to make the price lower and lower and lower and see how low they can get the price down on you. That's called bartering. You know a lot of people that probably do that, don't you? Well, going on here a little bit here. I'm sorry. The Aksumites began to rule over many other people, and the warriors fought nearby nations, and they became very powerful, and they ruled over even southern Arabia. They also defeated some of the Egyptians up north, so they became huge. Now, think about Christianity now. How did Christianity come into Africa? Well, let's think. We did have that Ethiopian eunuch in the Bible that Philip went out into the desert. He's actually brought out to the desert to God, and that Ethiopian eunuch was sitting there and reading the Word of God, reading the Old Testament, actually in Isaiah. And he's like, who could this be? Who could this be? And the picture was of Jesus. And so Philip gave the Ethiopian the gospel and said, exactly, that's all about Jesus. And the Bible's all about Jesus. And so the Ethiopian accepted Jesus as a savior, and then he wanted to be baptized, and then he went back to Ethiopia. So I'm sure that he spread the gospel. But there's another really magnificent story there too that we just read, and you can read it in your book. It's about King Ezana, and he became a Christian. Well, how did he become a Christian? Well, the church there, the first Ethiopian church, or the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, tells a story about a Christian philosopher who came over from Tyre, and he had two little boys. And they had heard, they were Christians, they had heard well, the boat, the ship gets attacked, and everyone's killed, but they take the two little boys as slaves. Well, the two young boys grow up to be young men, and their names are Frumentius, or you can say Frumentius and Adesius. Frumentius and Adesius. And these two young boys growing up, they had heard the gospel. And so what happened was the king, who had taken them as slaves, and one he had made a cupbearer, and the other he had made his treasurer, because they were must have been very intelligent boys. Well, he dies, and so the queen says, I'm going to let you guys reign until my son, Ezana, becomes king. So these young men raised Ezana. Frumentius became a Christian. Well, he was a Christian in the beginning, but he became a bishop there. And so he shared the gospel with King Ezana and taught the king all about Christianity. Ezana believed in Jesus. How sweet is that? And the gospel spread. King Ezana put a cross on their coins and had everyone share the gospel, had Frumentius and Adesius, both of them, share the gospel with everyone. Aksum had strong ties with the church in Constantinople after that, and the gospel spread from Africa even to Egypt. How amazing is that? But one unique finding that they found were these obelisks. Obelisks are like these, they look like big, huge, tall monuments. In fact, there are many stone ones there, and one was the stele of Aksum. And this was 97 foot tall, and they were all different, various heights. But the thing, they would have stories on them, and they would have pictures of windows and all kinds of other shapes and doors on them. It's kind of unique. But they had the story of how Aksum adopted Christianity on there, and he had Christian stories on those obelisks. How amazing. So when we talk about Africa, we can talk about Jesus. Because from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, my dispersed ones, will bring my offerings. Africa, they knew